Really excited about Art History Part 2 today. Just kidding. This is a panel on metadata and how much metadata you need in one place for that to just become data. I am joined today by a handful of folks that we think have excellent and refined thoughts on this topic. And I, in fact, have a presentation where we can introduce each of these hosts. There it is. So, to When Metadata Becomes Data, a panel discussion. I'm Drew Bannon. I'll be moderating today. And yeah, right, when I'm not doing art curation, I think a lot about the products that we build at Fishtown Analytics, Dbt Cloud, and the broader ecosystem. And so this stuff is top of mind for me. My hope is that I'm a little bit behind on making the 2021 roadmap. So hopefully D-Wall, Bar, John, and Matt can hook me up today. So first up, we have me. You already heard about me. We have Bar. Welcome to the stream, Bar.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
And in fact, if we can get everyone in on the stage too, we'll run through introductions. That'd be great. Thanks. Okay, Bar, why don't you introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are and what you spend your time thinking about?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Excited for the art curation discussion now. Just kidding. So yeah, my name is Barb Moses. I'm the founder and CEO of Monte Carlo. We're pioneering the data observability category, which means that we help companies trust their data by minimizing data downtime. Prior to Monte Carlo, I was VP at a company called Gainsight, which is a customer data company. So I've been in data for a while, and my background is in math and stats. And yeah, just a fun fact about me, I actually started my career in the Israeli Air Force, and my favorite all-time action movie is any movie by Bruce Willis. Looking forward to the panel.
Fair enough. Hey, Bart, what was the subject that you got the worst grade in college or high school?
Oh man, I think it was singing class. I'm a terrible singer. Actually, I got asked to not sing if possible during class. So I think that was probably the worst grade ever.
That's cruel. Well, thanks. We're happy you're here. Thanks for coming. Next up, we have John. John, you want to take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I am John Williams. I'm the Chief Product Officer and co-founder at Data.World, a data catalog and metadata management company that also manages a lot of our own data and a lot of our own metadata as well. How meta is that of the whole thing? You know, in the chat, I already said my worst subject in school was actuarial science, which is ironic because my father was one. And, you know, I always told my dad I went into computer science because I didn't want to count dead people for a living. That said, I don't know, other fun things. When I'm not doing tech stuff, I play guitar in a punk rock band here in Austin.
All right. Thanks, John. Glad to have you with us. Matt, you want to take a moment and say hi to everyone watching?
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt. I'm a senior data engineer at the Zebra. We're an insurance comparison website, and we're very data-driven, so data's been a big part of the company since pretty soon after it was founded. These days, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we know what we know, which is very confusing. My company, or my class that I did the worst in, I think, was multivariable calculus, which is a little bit shameful as a data engineer, but it was hard and I struggled.
I mean, who doesn't use calculus when debugging broken airflow deployments? I do all the time.
Right. Other fun things about me, before quarantine, I played in a pool league where I was mediocre. So that's me.
All right. Thanks so much, Matt. And finally, we have David Wallace. David, we've known each other for a long time, but I wonder if you could say hi to everyone.
Sure thing. Hey, everyone. I'm Dave. I'm a data engineer at a company called Good Eggs. We're an organic grocery delivery company operating out of the Bay Area. Unlike the typical grocery delivery company who buys products from the grocery store, we connect local food producers directly to local buyers. We've been using dbt for quite a while now. I would say that probably close to like 2 or 3 years at this point. And the overwhelming majority of our data operations run on dbt. And a lot of actually the most useful or the most valuable usage of metadata that we get centers strictly around metadata about dbt models themselves. So I'm really excited to talk more about that today. Worst class for me, definitely history. I think at this point in my life, I rely on Drew for most of my history knowledge. And fun things, I'm gonna steal John's, also a punk rocker, but at this point in my life, I am mostly a retired punk rocker or reformed punk rocker, so.
All right, thanks to you all. And because everyone's gonna wanna know, what's the name of your adorable dog?
My dog is named Banjo. He is off camera right now.
All right, get him in here. Thank you all for being with me today. It was a lot of fun collecting sort of all the wisdom and best practices from people in sort of preparation for this panel. And the way that we ended up on this group is each of you people are either individually or as a company doing really fascinating things, and you have really informed thoughts about the current state of the art around metadata management or a great vision of the future. So thanks again all for being with me. To kick us off, I want to answer the titular, I guess, question on everyone's mind. Metadata is data about data. It comes in many flavors and serves many audiences. How do you find that metadata can be helpful to the different stakeholders in your organization? And I wonder, there's kind of, maybe one of the things I should have said is we've got kind of two different perspectives here. We've got Dwal and Matt joining with the sort of practitioner perspective, and we have Bar and John from the sort of vendor general purpose solution perspective too. So I'm excited about the discussion. And Matt, I wonder if you could start us off.
Sure thing. So at the Zebra, I think one of the biggest questions that we're trying to answer with metadata is, where does the answer to this question come from, and can we trust it? We have a lot of data. We have a lot of data from different sources, and that data all gets sort of mashed together into, the data soup, and then we try and pull answers out of there. And then when you get an answer that's questionable, or an answer that seems out of date, or like maybe it's not what you expected, answering the question of like, where did this come from, becomes really important. So lots of things around, when was this data pulled in? When was it tested? Did it pass those tests? And what type of source are we talking about here? And then there's sort of organizational information around, do we think as an organization that this data should be trusted or not? Which is a little bit less technical, but just as useful for stakeholders.
Yeah, and Matt, I wonder if I could prompt you, who are the kinds of stakeholders that want to know the answers to these questions? Are they in the data function, or are they outside of sort of the specific data function?
I would say for us, a lot of times it's people outside of the specific data function. So it's true business stakeholders, marketing executives and people in our commercialization team and things like that are wanting to know, they're wanting to make business decisions with the data right now, and they're seeing things that confuse them, and they want to know why.
All right, and so thanks, Matt. I wonder, David, can you riff on that? Anything you agree with or disagree with? Or maybe feel differently about?
No, yeah, I mean, we're in a very, very similar boat. I would say that we do all of that. I think the only thing that I would add to that is also a priority for us is we very much think of DBT models as data assets here. They're similar to any other data-related asset we would produce. And what we try to do with a lot of our DBT metadata is we try to essentially proactively guard against what we internally call asset atrophy or DBT model atrophy, right? And what I mean by that is, as the business focuses tend to shift as they are to do, DBT models over time have a tendency to just atrophy, as in they become less relevant, forgotten, redundant, misleading, any of the bad things we can think about regarding assets. And what we try to use our metadata for is to essentially limit the amount of atrophy that happens within our DBT project as well.
All right, thanks, Dwal. I think we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that later. I loved reading about your thinking on this topic. Bar, I wonder if we could go to you. What's your perspective? Do you share the same sentiments? Do you think about it a different way at all?
Yeah, we're talking about data, or metadata becoming data, and it sort of reminds me of that movie Inception, right? And you're like, which level of the world are we in right now? Is this our data about our data, our customers' data about our data? Like, there can be so many different layers, which is pretty awesome. But yeah, I mean, I think I agree with David and Matt, and I think, my perspective is in many ways, maybe sort of a controversial statement, but I think metadata by itself is actually useless. Just having a piece of sort of information about other kinds of information is not particularly helpful. The power of metadata for any stakeholder comes from tying it to a particular use case or a particular question, like Matt's question, can I trust this data, for example? So just to take like a particular example, if you think about lineage as a, part of metadata, just looking at lineage is just a pretty map, right? Yeah, you start with it, you're like, oh, okay, this is awesome. This is connected to this. I didn't know that. but actually it becomes useless pretty soon after if you don't tie it to a real use case. So a real use case could be, who's actually relying on this asset when I'm making a change to it, or who's actually using this data. Maybe it hasn't been used for 3 years and it shouldn't even be on this map. And so really sort of digging into the questions and the why behind it brings life and purpose to metadata.
Okay, hearing a lot of similar themes here. Bar, I do want to drill into one of the things you just said, but before we do that, John, I want to give you the opportunity to give your take.
Yeah, I like, I'm going to concur with all of our panelists here. And the idea of data being, or metadata being data about your data and the inception aspect of it. One of the things we like to think about in our product is the idea of metadata and data catalog being an information radiator for your data analytics ecosystem. I think, if you're thinking about your data and analytics ecosystem, taking a very product-oriented approach around what is going to help my downstream analysts better use my data, and you think about how you present information about your data analytics resources that you have and what additional information you need to collect to make those decisions around what data resources to use better, it'll help you better decide what metadata to collect, right? One of the things that I am very passionate about and I think is very important here, though, is that metadata itself does need to be treated as data, because metadata and having a consistent way of accessing it, a consistent place to access it, is a consistent way to represent it is really important, because it's what ultimately makes our data analytics ecosystems composable and usable. If you don't want to buy everything or use everything from one single vendor, metadata is really the key to making all the different parts of your data analytics life cycle work together. And you need to make that consistently accessible to all those systems. And I think just the industry writ large would do really well. If you think about data ops, if we start thinking about how do we make more metadata interoperable so that we can, somebody like David or Matt can select the best part of their tool, the best tools for each part of their life cycle that they want to support that's most appropriate for their organizations.
Yeah, thanks, John. I like that a lot. It's such a fascinating thing that we can have these conversations about use cases like lineage and quality and provenance, but the common thread that seems to run through all of them, especially as we think about provenance across tools, is the metadata. It's the data about the data. And my question for you is sort of a foundational one. Depending on your answer, we might just hang up the stream and end the conversation right here. Is it even fruitful to think about this in terms of metadata, or should we be talking more about use cases like lineage and quality and say observability or awareness? What do y'all think? And maybe we'll be a little bit less structured here going forwards. Just chime in with what you're feeling. D-Ball, you can start.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I feel like we are kind of forced into thinking about use cases, I think, because I think without utility, what are we doing here, right? So for me, the use case always drives the work to be done. It just so happens that a lot of the use cases and problems we have been trying to solve personally, largely the solutions to those have been metadata oriented for us, which I think has really driven us to focus so much on metadata recently. So yeah, to answer your question, maybe a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I think the two are very much entwined with each other. I think without use case, maybe there is no need for metadata or thinking about metadata.
There's a thread in Slack right now about, do you ever collect metadata without a purpose in mind? And I think the answer is yes, because as somebody said, sometimes you don't know that you need something until 6 months later, and then all of a sudden it's useful to know that you've been collecting information about, what user agent your data came from or whatever this whole time. And so now you can answer this question in a really direct, meaningful way, where if you hadn't been collecting that because you didn't have a use case in mind, all of a sudden you're stuck. You could say, well, we can fix it going forward, but we can't fix it for the past.
Isn't this similar to the age-old debate around should you log everything or just collect information on what's important, right? You can obviously argue both sides of that coin. I think even more so than I definitely fall on the collect everything side of the equation, but I think even more so with metadata, which is exactly your point, Matt. yeah, you might be guilty of collecting something that may not be useful, but especially if you're thinking about applying this to like risk and compliance use cases, not having that metadata on the things in your past could actually hurt you getting a risk and compliance program off the ground and turn into this big, like, chore of having to go through and either redocument or reintroduce metadata to everything, which can be a pretty big lift too, right? So if you can add metadata incrementally, I'm a proponent of doing that.
I think we've become really, really good at collecting a lot of data, right? Sort of in that spirit of like, let's just like hoard everything that we can and like collect everything and store everything, right? Like I think like we've just become exceptionally good as an industry doing that in the last decade. And the need for metadata is actually driven by that, right? Because a lot of questions are like, okay, so is this model still relevant? What's the atrophy on it? Can I still use it? And so, I definitely agree. Like we also have this tendency to want to collect everything. And to a certain degree, I agree with that. But I think we also, maybe the main challenge is sort of, we're going to end up with so much metadata. How do we actually make sense of it, right? And I think that's sort of the fundamental challenge that we haven't unlocked today. We're really good at collecting data. We're really good at storing it, really good at processing it, really good at analyzing it. Now we're starting to collect more and more metadata, but like, what do we do with it? So in a sense, I feel like we'd be setting us up for failure if we don't think about the use cases and the risks. Maybe one day we'll have metadata about metadata about metadata.
Turtles all the way down.
That would be terrible. Yeah, then the world would explode and yeah.
Gosh, well, it might be job security for all of us. So I think it's great we're talking about use cases, and I want to drill into a couple of these. So some of the things that I see that just scream metadata to me kind of out in the world as products today involve data discovery or data cataloging. They might involve lineage or some notion of data quality. I, in a talk earlier today, check out the recording on YouTube if you haven't seen it already, motivated that there are new problems that are not currently being addressed. And Bar, I actually am curious if you want to speak to some of those. And my question is about, is it sensible to draw the lines between these different kinds of use cases, or is it really all just one thing?
It's a great question. And I think, sort of tying back to sort of the lineage as an example, I think if you take lineage as sort of a part of your metadata, it can power different use cases that you mentioned, right? So it can power sort of data discovery and data catalogs, right? By learning sort of what's being used by who and how. But then lineage can also power sort of, kind of data trust and data quality that we mentioned. I think the interesting things about sort of data discovery in particular is that it's sort of our automated metadata and data discovery is actually powering, I think, sort of next generation catalogs. And curious to hear sort of from Matt and David what they're using and how they think about sort of data catalogs today. But I think some of the things that we're seeing is that there's sort of this increased need for automation and also ability to sort of scale as the data changes, especially when we're thinking about unstructured data. And maybe the third sort of thing that I'm seeing is that, oftentimes data is distributed, but the way that we think about metadata isn't actually. And so there's this gap between these things. And so I think strong use of metadata can actually make all of these sort of use cases that you mentioned, whether it's data discovery or data quality or data trust, can actually sort of supercharge them just because sort of our need for getting a more kind of sophisticated or scalable or automated way to do those. So I'm really excited about how metadata can supercharge those. And I agree with you that it's less about the delineation between, am I now in sort of data discovery or data quality mode, and more around how do I make use of these metadata assets, if you will, in a way that enables better discovery so that someone can answer the question of like, where is my data or when was it last queried and by who way faster, as an example, in a way more automated way.
Right on. Thanks, Bar.
Yeah, I mean, the cataloging question is definitely interesting to me, obviously, since we are a data catalog vendor and a metadata management vendor. And, I think that, one of the things about that is, we want to be able to collect as much metadata and represent it and make it queryable and useful to people as we can, right? Regardless of the system that generated it, and then help people organize that into use cases that they can use. I mean, that's what a good data catalog should be and do, I think. I mean, to that end, there's actually a Slack chat going on. I'm about to type into it that, we are, we actually analyze, the output of dbt runs manifesting catalog.json to be able to put that next to other metadata so that, you can combine that with other systems and build these use cases that you want to out of them.
All right, D-Wall or Matt, do you want to speak to the sort of practitioner perspective? What kinds of tools do you have to solve these problems today, and how does it feel using them?
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of our tooling is internally built, and regarding the metadata and cataloging, a lot of our focus has really been around starting to, or at least trying to, express these hidden dependencies between systems in some way. Drew spoke earlier in his talk about this term opaque and isolated dependencies. I think it's an issue that we all bump up against at some point, where we have various tooling doing different jobs, but they all sort of implicitly rely on each other in some unexpressed way. And again, what we've been trying to do recently is start to express those dependencies. From a more concrete perspective, the way that we actually do that is we use the already existing wonderful graph that dbt provides us that shows all of the relationships between all of our dbt nodes. And we actually just extend that graph outwards horizontally to encapsulate more tooling within our system. And we explicitly add nodes to that graph that express other nodes in other systems. That way we have this holistic view of our entire data platform that users can actually go in and see, oh, this dashboard relies on this query, and this query relies on these two dbt models, and these two dbt models rely on these two Snowflake tables, and these two Snowflake tables rely on these two ingesters, like all the way down. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to achieve here. And most of it is around expressing that lineage to be much more holistic than it already is.
So I want to go kind of in a different direction than that, because I actually find, so one of the biggest tools that we use is the Dbt Tag View, and that's kind of my go-to for where does my data come from and where does it go, because we use dbt for all of our data transformations, basically. So it does provide a nice centralized place. But I actually find that one of my biggest problems is that there's too much information in it, where we break things up into so many small models, and you have so many layers. And going back to the talk yesterday about modularity and layering, if you don't do that really well, your DAG becomes a mess really quickly. So one of the things we've been looking at is basically how can we improve the Dbt Doc Site, and actually playing around with different things we can do internally, so that we can say, can we basically condense things down and see like the 10,000 foot view and actually get something useful out of that, instead of being stuck in this world where every little implementation detail is surfaced in a way that is distracting. So I think there's a lot of potential for really good improvements to these tools, where we could basically say, what do we really need to know? We need to know about the connections between these high-level modules. We need to know about the connection between source and destination, but we don't necessarily need to know every single little detail, even though as data people, we'd love to collect all the metadata about all those things. At some point, it becomes noise.
I actually love sort of both of your answers, because I think it sort of speaks to the challenge that we're seeing here. Like on the one hand, it feels like, sort of in isolation, metadata about sort of a very particular asset is important, but we sort of need to move to this sort of like holistic end-to-end view that David spoke about, because everything is intertwined, right? So if there's a model that depends on sort of tables and Snowflake, that depends on sort of, another process upstream that depends on, maybe thousands of sources sometimes, you really want to think about that end to end. On the other hand, it's so easy to over collect when you think about that, right? And to end up with just too much information, to Matt's point, that you don't actually need or end up using. And I think figuring out maybe like the hierarchy of use cases and the hierarchy of sort of metadata applications is maybe sort of the most important thing for us to figure out. Like, what is the part of that I really can't live without? And by me, I mean like both data producers and data consumers, right? Because what a data producer needs in this hierarchy is different from what a data consumer might need. And it also will vary between different data consumers. So whatever the your marketing team needs is different than what your executives might need. So I can almost imagine like, this like hierarchy of metadata per producer or consumer of data.
Sure.
You guys should tell me if it sounds crazy. Yeah.
No, I love a fractal. My love of triangles is well known, and it's the idea of triangles inside of the triangles, and it just feels so much like our world. Like, you want to understand things at a macro level, and then you want to go deeper, and they're complex in their own way too. And I think it speaks to sort of this almost dichotomy of, you want to have all the data so that you can answer questions kind of post hoc when they come up, but also you need to start with the questions. You can't start with the data you have. And it's nuanced and complex. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so specifically on the lineage example bar, we see that a lot in a lot of our deployments where people, instead of loading all of the lineage metadata in, create what they call like business views, where they're only looking at like table to table instead of like table, and then every little process in between. What they're really looking to do is, going back to Matt's original use cases, create trust for your consumers. And every organization is going to have a different level of what's important there. But then as you get into these deeper use cases like impact analysis and like, when you have breaks and they're trying to figure that out, like how do you get people into the tools that might have the deeper stuff that they need?
John, I wonder if you can say more about impact analysis and maybe what that looks like practically.
Yeah, so I mean, impact analysis, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term impact analysis, that's a use case for lineage information, which is, I am going to make a change in an upstream model and I want to know every downstream system that it impacts. There are definitely tools out there in the market that do this, some very deep like lineage, computation tools that will do everything from like, scan source code repositories looking for references to models and things like that. And then they generate obviously a tremendous amount of metadata as well. But doing that kind of impact analysis is one of the core use cases that we see out there that people ask for a lot out of lineage. It's a hard problem though, right? It's a hard problem in that, it's really, really hard to ascertain where all the systems are that make use of the data. And, this is where I get into a little bit of opinion for sure, which is I actually think it's really hard to do it in an automated way, right? In a way that can cover all your bases. You need ways of augmenting that so that you can do that kind of impact analysis. And ultimately, one of the things I love about DBT is that, like, if you think about how DBT generates its DAGs when you're just dropping ref and source tags in, right? It's a really light way of documenting lineage, right? In a really developer-friendly way. I'd like to see more things be created like that, like ways to annotate like ETL code to say what your inputs and outputs are that could be, then emitted as metadata and made use of by downstream systems in explicit ways, rather than trying to magic up your lineage, right? Which I think ultimately, is, you might get you a fair number of the ways, a fair bit of the way there. But yeah, I'd love to see people doing that.
Right on. That really to me feels like, the version of observability as I understand it. It's things like, how did the data get here?
Oh my
when
God.
was it loaded?
I think I just put in the Slack chat too. I think my favorite new feature of DBT is actually exposures.
Yeah.
Right? Just being able to in a lightweight way be like, this thing and this thing are using it, right? Like, and if we keep that kind of information as close to the code as we can, and then we keep that metadata as close to the data as we can, when people make changes, it'll become obvious what those changes are rather than trying to hunt them down later.
Right on.
Yeah. To add to that, we also are very big fans of exposures, and we already use them pretty extensively internally. And one of the really cool things about exposures is that a lot of the work we did as far as extending our graph horizontally to include more assets from different systems was done prior to exposures existing. And one of the really cool things is that because we already had this pre-existing graphs this pre-existing graph that already described all of the relationships between DBT nodes and other assets. We were actually just able to programmatically create exposures for everything. So now at this point, we basically have a batch job that runs that automatically updates all of our exposure definitions for us based on what's already expressed in our graph, which is really cool. I mean, in what John was saying around impact analysis, we have a pretty crude version of that happening right now with DBT, where because we sometimes can't test the effects that changing a DBT model will have to like a third-party node expressed somewhere else, like let's say a mode report, what we will instead do is essentially report back an impact analysis in a GitHub PR and say like, hey, the thing you're changing has an API contract between this other thing expressed in this third-party service. Just validate that. That's the potential impact, and let's validate the API contract before we make any significant changes here. So that's stuff that we're thinking about as well.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I think, from a practical standpoint, though, when you think about this, like it's important to realize that you can do it incrementally, right? Like, it's like adding unit tests to normal software code, right? Like you can add these annotations bit by bit. If you add it to your process, that whenever you check in new DBT code, that like the documentation and the exposures have to be like one step better than what you left it. It doesn't have to be perfect from the get-go, and you can do it in incremental ways. And even if you look beyond the scope of DBT, as you look at like other tools, if you look for things that enable you to work in that incremental way, your life is just going to be better in general, right?
There's also something I wonder. Oh, I was just going to say, I wonder how much the structure of your DBT code influences how useful these tools and processes are, because sometimes I find that when things are too interconnected, it makes it very difficult to know, like, okay, we did an impact analysis and we found that everything is affected. Hooray. Because it turns out that, you're changing the central model that contains like user definitions, and user definitions are used everywhere and things like that. So there's almost a downside to we pushed all of our stuff from Looker PDTs down into DBT models. For those that aren't familiar with Looker PDTs, they're just another way to build tables from other tables. We made that change so that we could have everything in one place, but now everything's in one place and everything's interconnected. So there's kind of trade-offs there, I think.
That actually is an excellent point. One of the problems that we've experienced with doing this kind of impact analysis of like highly, highly connected nodes is that, like Matt said, sometimes the report will come back and say, hey, it looks like you're possibly affecting every single node in the entire graph and also every single mode report that exists, right? So it's also something that we're thinking about. And actually going back to metadata, one of the things that we're thinking about to address that is using more like consumption-oriented metadata to actually limit the impact analysis to essentially highly important things, right? So maybe we don't want to report back and say that every single thing is affected, but maybe we will report back and say, hey, this change you're making could affect this highly, highly connected and important node in the graph, or it could affect this highly important mode report that's looked at 1,000 times a day, stuff like that. So yep, totally agree with that issue and stuff that we're thinking about as well.
It's really very cool, and I'm thinking now about sort of the graph theory bases for computing, which are the nodes with high impact. Bar, I don't feel like we can have a conversation about sort of observability in data without getting your take. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just echo sort of what was said. Like, I'm really excited about, how companies like DBT and others are thinking about metadata, because it's honestly like, it feels like an inevitable step that we all need to take. And so really grateful for you all making this sort of easier and democratizing metadata in a sense, right? Which I think we need to do if we haven't already. And I think the sort of a lot of what we think about is, what are the parts of metadata, like going back to our discussion earlier, what kinds of metadata is most useful and where to actually get started from. And what we've found is that sort of this concept of data observability is something that folks are thinking more and more about. So those not familiar with that, what that actually means, it draws from the concept of sort of observability in software engineering, where, similar to how it's really obvious that you'd have unit tests for your data, it's really obvious that you would want to get a sense of the health of your applications in software engineering by having sort of visibility into the health of your applications. And so the concept of observability is just a corollary to that, meaning by observing the output of the system, we can actually understand the health of it. And so by observing the outputs of our data, we can better understand the health of that. And so we actually kind of believe in kind of 5 core sort of principles of data observability. And actually they are all metadata, right? So things like lineage and freshness and volume and schema, all those stuff that really sort of power our ability to use data, to run sort of better models. And so what we see kind of in working with sort of our customers and folks is that once you actually have sort of that information, that metadata available and tied to the right use case, you can sort of move faster as a company or as an organization. You can make changes with more confidence, et cetera. So I think there's sort of a lot of power in metadata, especially when it's tied to these particular use cases.
Okay, great, thanks. So next up, I have a bit of a 2-part question. The first one is, who owns this problem? Whose job is it to care about these things, at least in your opinion? And the second part of this comes from Slack. I think we can hit at the same time. At what point should teams start to take this seriously? Is it appropriate for data teams of one? Is that the person who has to care, or does it become a problem as you grow?
I'm curious when David and Matt started thinking about this. Like, at what point in the organization did it sort of start becoming? Because I think that's sort of the ultimate test, right? When you actually start putting sort of resources and thoughts into it. So curious when it came up for you all.
Yeah, I think this answer may be cheating a little bit, but I'm pretty sure that I was hired to think about this stuff. So potentially day one for me. It depends. I think the 2 questions that you just asked are sort of entwined in a way. I think that this stuff is, at a small company, potentially everyone's job, but also potentially not important enough yet to really spend time thinking about. I think it's really a question of scale. I think when companies hit a scale where your DBT project becomes large, or your DBT project is large, and all of a sudden your assets are highly important and empowering, highly mission critical operational style dashboards, that's when I think it's time to start thinking about this stuff. It also depends on team size, right? So I would say that, an analytics team of size 10 probably requires one person to start at least thinking about this stuff more often than they're thinking about regular data modeling questions. But it is a hard question to answer. But to answer your question about when I started thinking about this stuff, again, probably day one.
Yeah, so I think for us, we actually have just started building out like a data stewardship organization to try and help us manage some of these questions more deliberately. So having people who their whole job is to worry about the quality of our data and where it comes from and what we're doing with it, instead of having their job be to go implement new features and answer new questions and do new integrations and things like that. So we're really putting our eggs there and saying, like, let's get some people dedicated to this. But also I think that ultimately a lot of this is going to fall back down onto the developers who are implementing this stuff. Ultimately you need resources to go in and actually build your tooling to implement, your new fancy tool that's going to help you track all this metadata and do something with it. And so you can't really get away from the fact that, you need your developers to care. As far as when they should care, I think that a lot of this comes back to, like, how difficult is this stuff to do? How self-service is it versus like, oh, you need to go build an entire tool yourself. I would say definitely don't go start building your own tools when you have one person and you're trying to answer your basic KPIs and get a data organization off the ground. On the other hand, if your tooling can make these questions easy to answer by default, then you can build with that in mind. So, if we had started our data organization with dbt, I think we would have ended up with a different model of the world than what we did, right? Because we would have had a good lineage graph right out of the box that we could use as we're building the models. So I think that, if we make these tools easier to use and easier to set up, then they can potentially actually help you get off the ground in a more efficient way than trying to, be the team of one who's got the whole world on their shoulders.
Yeah, So both of us being Austin-based companies, a lot of the tooling we use at Data.World and vice versa at the Zebra has been kind of inspired. And I am a huge fan of how the Zebra and Matt's organization organizes their entire data practice. It's been really awesome to watch, and I know a lot of the folks there. And I think what they do in terms of data product management and data stewardship, and when they've added and been very thoughtful about how they grow that team, has been awesome. As to the when is it right to do it? I mean, if you think about it from a hygiene standpoint, right? And I love to draw parallels to software development lifecycle to data analytics, which is when was the right time to start using source control when you build software? When is the right time to start introducing bug tracking? And when is the right time to document and do unit tests, right? You can get away with not doing that stuff from the get-go. As soon as other people start relying on your code, you definitely want it in place. And I think it's very similar. I think you can also, to Matt's point, pick and select tools and ways of working that enable you to collect metadata, or maybe even document metadata in small ways from the get-go. So it's not a chore. You don't have to introduce a heavyweight tool or build your own or buy a data catalog like us from day one. But if the tools you choose, use Dbt, and then making sure that you are putting some documentation in it, right? Making sure that you are source controlling some of this stuff, those sorts of things. If you do if you're smart about it from the early days, it doesn't have to be a big lift later on, right? You can just evolve your tool chain as your organization grows and scales. You go and add the automated data quality tooling, you go and add a big old data catalog or metadata management package or a governance package. But if you've got the little bits along the way, adding those tools as your organization scales becomes a lot easier.
Thanks, John. So we've got 5 odd minutes left, and I want to hit a couple of the questions we haven't gotten to yet. I figure we'll go more of a sort of lightning round. So there's gonna be a lot more to say about all these things. Let's plant the seed and say the controversial thing you believe, and then you can defend yourself. And I'd love to follow up with you on Slack after the talk. So first up, we'll just go around the horn. What problem do you feel like we're just on the cusp of solving, but that we haven't quite solved yet in this space? I can start if it'll help. I would say column level lineage and leave it at that.
I think the problem of lineage in a way that gives you that 10,000-foot view. So the macro level lineage is something that we're almost there, but not quite.
Very specific and the very broad too.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I'll go. This is actually related to lineage. I'm going to go with composability, right? Being able to build our data analytics ecosystem out of small tools and it have all of these things hung together, right? The whole landscape is dominated by single vendor solutions and everybody trying to claim to have a silver bullet. But I think, as more people start to care about metadata, standardization of metadata, we'll be able to build composable systems that suit our organization sizes and scale significantly more effectively.
Yeah, I agree with John. I think composability, I think we're close, but we're not quite there yet.
I agree with those. I will add, I think having no data is way better than having bad data, for sure, from day one, probably. And I think maybe one of those areas where we're getting close on is data discovery. I think we've gotten way better at that. There's a little bit more to do, but we've gotten better at that.
All right, thanks for running. And kind of the follow-up question there, see what you think. What problem are we just totally unable to address whatsoever today that we think is important? For my part, I'm going to say this is not a technical problem. This is going to be a sort of social organizational problem. It's how data builders and data consumers work together to solve these problems.
Yeah, I like that. I also think that analytics, reproducibility, analytics, not data and downstream. A lot of these are trying to solve that problem, but reproducibility has both technical and social components to it that make it really hard and intractable. And the state of the art right now is kind of ridiculous, right? I love notebooks as much as the next guy, but like that doesn't really solve reproducibility by itself. Like it's such a like huge problem.
I like that.
I think refactoring in a way that doesn't suck would be amazing. Some really high quality software engineering style refactoring tools that could help us do some of the operations that would help clean up our DAGs and get our data to a better spot.
Yep, I agree. I think in terms of composability, I'm going to go back to the fact of some sort of automated dependency expression for all of these composed systems working together. As in, how can I have a system that automatically infers all of the dependencies between systems without someone needing enough domain context to know and explicitly express those dependencies?
And I will say that one of the things that I'm most excited about is like how many sort of different solutions and different ideas there are in this space. Maybe one thing that I think we sort of, need to figure out is like, if I sort of want to get started, where do I get started? And not so much of a technical problem, but I think lots of questions that I get is like, what is the, how should I be thinking about metadata to begin with? Or like, how should I, to question like, when should I be starting to think about this and how? And so I think some of those fundamental questions are actually not solved today, especially when it comes to like, literally, where do I get started?
Okay, great. And to round us out, the last question I have for all of you is, there's a lot of tools in this space that already exist. There's more yet that are still to come. It's a very exciting future ahead of us. When you think about this tooling, build or buy, and open source or proprietary, what's your preference? We get one sentence each.
I mean, I'll go first. What the heck? I'm a vendor. Of course you should buy. No, building is good. Building is good too, right? And I think there are some incredible open source solutions in this space in metadata management as well. I just want us all to be able to get along better and be able to compose those solutions well, right? I will say, while there are exciting open source solutions in the space as well, remember open source is free like puppies, not free like beer. And that's why great folks like Fishtown have your premium offering as well as the open source offering. So, I mean, I'm really excited that there's a continuum that people can experiment in and an ecosystem forming around it. And that's what I'll say. Sorry, that was more than one sentence.
It's like, did you say free like puppies?
Yeah, it's an old saying about open source, right? Open source is free as in puppies, not free as in beer. If somebody hands you a free beer, you drink the beer and you go on your way.
All right,
Great
I
day.
get it. Fair enough. So we're going to be a little bit over time, so maybe we'll keep it to just the one sentence each to round us out.
I can just say, I think it really depends like on the company and what your needs are. And yeah, so as a vendor, I would recommend doing what's right for both you and for your customers. Sometimes the answer is different solutions. One long sentence there.
Count it.
I think that your solution for this problem of knowledge about your knowledge needs to mirror your organizational structure. And if you can find good tools to buy, then do it. But otherwise, you're going to be stuck building.
Yep.
You will.
Agree with that. I think it depends. I generally fall, someone said this a long time ago, but I generally fall on the side of build if you consider it to be your team's core competency, buy otherwise.
It's a great line. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. There is a wealth of great questions and amazing discussions in the Coalesce Metadata channel on Slack. I hope you all join me in there and follow up on some of our thoughts and some of the community's thoughts over the next half hour or so.